job of digging graves for hire. 1 a.m. True story in the family of a brother who shared it with our channel. He recounted it as follows. My hometown is a rural area, where Kwan Ho songs are deeply ingrained in the subconscious. Memories of the banyan tree at the beginning of the village and the well in the communal house's yard are etched in the hearts of every person here. The first story I want to tell is about my great-grandparents. Listening to my grandparents tell me that in the past, my family was famous for digging graves, rare burials, basically building houses for the dead. My grandfather is no exception. But after that fateful incident, my grandmother strictly forbade my grandfather from continuing the family business. My great-grandfather's name was Seven, and he was famous throughout the village up and down because of his talent for picking graves. In a few villages, only my family is involved in the grave digging business, so we can earn a lot of money during the season. That day was a summer afternoon, the weather was as hot as fire. My grandfather was lying in a bamboo hammock taking a lunch break when a hurried call came from the fence. Mr. Seven, Mr. Seven. It was the call of Mrs. Kiva, who at that time was the richest person in the village because her mother's side worked as a slaughterhouse for cattle, buffaloes, cows, pigs. At that time, only a few homes had black and white TVs, but her house had a color TV and a DVD player. Seeing her hurriedly running in, my grandfather jumped up from the hammock he was lying in and looked out. Calling out from inside the house, "What's going on at Kiva's house that the midday sun has come to my house?" Mrs. Kiva took off her hat and sat down on the steps. The June sun darkened her skin. Shaking her hat to relieve the heat, she said, "Uncle Seven, I don't know what's going on these days. I keep dreaming of my daughter, standing by the door and sobbing. The water is flooded and it's very cold. Since you know a lot about these issues, what do you think?" My grandfather stroked his chin, which had a few gray whiskers, thoughtfully thinking, then answered for a long time, "Are you sure it's your sister Jenny?" My grandfather asked again to be sure. "I'm sure, even though I can't see her face clearly, the voice is unmistakably Jenny's." Mrs. Kiva put her hat on the ground and did not fan it anymore and answered, "Then go and invite Mr. Five to come down and take a look. When is a good time, let me know so I can rebury you." Hearing what my grandfather said made sense, Mrs. Kiva immediately asked permission to go home and run to Teacher Five's house. It is said that Miss Jenny is the only daughter of Mrs. Kiva. Her husband passed away when Miss Jenny was just a toddler. From then on, mother and child raised each other until the age of 17, when she did not know why she died unexpectedly. People told each other that because Mrs. Kiva's family did a lot of killing, the karma it took on Miss Jenny. After 5 p.m., Mrs. Kiva hurriedly ran to my grandfather's house. At that time, my grandmother was carrying her child around the yard and my grandfather was out in the fields, so he was not home. Seeing my grandmother, Mrs. Kiva conveyed the invitations that Teacher Five had told her, and also told my grandmother to go home and tell him. It wasn't until dark that my grandfather returned. From afar, she saw him bringing back a fishworm that was full of perch. She went to the gate to welcome her and also recounted what happened in the afternoon, Mrs. Home. My grandfather nodded to show he understood, then turned to the well yard to wash his hands and feet and butcher some fish. Nearly 1 o'clock at night, my grandfather had prepared all the necessary tools. Accompanying him were 3 other people, all of whom were members of my family. The hour came. All 4 of them, shovels and hoes in hand, trudged into the night. It can be said that this profession of grave digging has trained them a spirit of steel. The four of them took a shortcut through the first wing to reach the cemetery at the far end of the village. At this time, Teacher 5 and Mrs. Kiva's family members were fully present at Miss Jenny's grave. Teacher Nam was holding a ceremony to ask for a burial, and then used a coin to ask for a yin-yang station. "No, we have to wait until 3 a.m. to dig," Mr. 5 said as he strained his eyes to look at the 2 coins in the bowl, his expression somewhat unsightly. "So all 4 of my family members had to find some abandoned grave to rest temporarily." At that time, there were many abandoned graves of people who had passed away for a long time without family members coming to visit them. There are also tombs of whom it is unknown that, following the flow of time, were eventually buried down there. Not long after he had fallen asleep, my grandfather felt his shoulder as if someone was gently shaking him. In his sleep, he pushed that person's hand aside. "Uncle 7, please don't dig up my grave." The sound was decisive but brought a magical feeling to his eardrums. This voice had to be replayed several times before my grandfather fully woke up. As soon as he woke up, he told the story of his dream to Mrs. Kiva. Hearing this, Mrs. Kiva was also very confused and told this story to Mr. 5. Only when Mr. 5 confirmed that there was no problem did she feel a little reassured. A while later, it was 3 a.m., my men also started their work. 4 heroic people dug for more than an hour before reaching the lid of the coffin underneath. My grandfather used a spatula to gently pry up the lid of the coffin. A long time has passed, so the coffin is almost half rotten, and with a little force, it can be opened. As soon as the coffin was opened, everyone present immediately burned 3 stars. Everyone who took it was extremely surprised because after so many years, Jenny's body was still the same as before. After that time I heard from my grandfather. When my grandfather came home he had a fever for several days, and the people who were with him also suffered the same condition. His entire body was covered in blisters that were as rough as skin. At night, I often mumble something unclear when I sleep. She was so scared that she invited Teacher 5 to come and perform the ceremony. She heard him say that my grandfather was invaded by negative energy while opening the coffin lid and was taken out of his mind, so that's why. After that tragedy, my family abandoned me, and no one was a grave digger anymore. Next is the story about my grandfather. My grandfather's name is Michael. From the day his family stopped working as a grave digger, he switched to farming for the cooperative. In 1975, he worked as a driver transporting weapons and food from north to south. My great-grandfather was afraid that his grandfather would die in the battlefield, so he took care of him, so his age was the only one who stayed at home and worked in agriculture. Even now, my grandfather still sometimes blames me. If in the past he had kept going so far, now he would still have his pension. At times like that, we tease, "Why are you so sorry? If you're unlucky, you won't have a chance to spend money." This story happened around 2009, that year I was in 7th grade. That afternoon, I followed some children in the neighborhood to play marbles. While playing ham, a motorbike driver approached from afar. This woman was my aunt's sister-in-law. As soon as I saw her face and immediately said hello. As soon as she saw me, she said very loudly, "Go back and tell Dad to go to the intersection and pick up his bike." After speaking, she drove the car to take my grandfather home. At this time, my grandfather seemed to have lost his soul. His eyes were hazy and he kept looking where I didn't know. Children at that time were very playful, and I was no exception. But seeing him like that, I was no longer in the mood to play anymore. I ran home quickly and left my marbles behind. He was helped to bed by everyone, and then she used oil to blow the wind for him. About 30 minutes later, my dad and I went to pick up the car. My father and I walked along the road full of bumpy cobblestones. From afar, I saw many people standing along the edge of the lagoon. They looked towards the bamboo bushes not too far away. Seeing that, my father immediately stopped and asked, "What's the matter?" The other man turned to look at my father and answered, "Mr. Andrew drowned, had a seizure or something, and when he was picked up, his mouth bit into his bicep." "So have they brought him home yet?" "I just sent you away, where are you two going?" This man turned to ask me and my father again. "I went to pick up Mr. Michael's car. I didn't know how to go but fell into the lagoon and was brought home by two neighbors." My father also answered frankly. When this person heard this, he pointed to the intersection a little way from here. "Ah, I heard it was said that up there, go up there and try to find out." After waiting, my father and I went up to the place the other person had just pointed out. On the grass bank, my sandals were still neatly placed in one place. I climbed down to pick up his slippers, and my dad jumped down to look for the car. It took about 15 minutes to find it. Time passed a few days later, when Grandpa was well again. I just ran in to ask. My grandfather told me that that day, Uncle Daniel's house was about to have dinner, so he invited him down for a drink. After nearly 12 o'clock, after eating, he took his bike home. When we reached the lagoon bridge, our eyes suddenly became dark, and I felt like someone was pulling my hand away. Fortunately, the other two women had just returned from eating at Uncle Daniel's house. As they passed by, they saw my grandfather fall down. My grandfather was blessed with great fortune, so it was okay. My grandfather also told me that the day after he fell asleep or dreamed of a shirtless boy, he said, "I'm Mr. Anthony's son." The other day, when he was herding buffalo and bathing in the lagoon, he drowned. "I've been here for a long time. When I saw you passing by, I forced you to come down so I could get to shore." My grandfather told this story to her. She was an idealistic person, so she also believed it. Where did my grandmother find a lot of strawberry branches to tie to the main door and window? There were also a lot of garlic hanging in the house. A few days later, Mr. Anthony went to his son's house, which was right next to my house. My grandmother asked about it, and after hearing the story clearly, Mr. Anthony confirmed it. It is true that the day before, his eldest son drowned. But he died a long time ago, so no one remembers him anymore. After that time, it seemed that Mr. Anthony's family also called him to hold a ceremony to welcome the deceased. There was another life or death experience, around the beginning of 2016, when my grandfather got tetanus and had to stay in the hospital for 2 months. Of those, 40 days were spent in a coma in the emergency room. My grandmother stayed to take care of him, and my aunts and father took turns going back and forth. After more than 2 long months, my grandfather was finally discharged home. Due to lying in one place for a long time, his heel was showing signs of severe necrosis. She carefully took care of him, bit by bit, plucking each almond leaf to boil water for his feet. I vividly remember the day he could walk again. He leaned on a stick made from a tree branch my father cut for him. Each step was hesitant, but as a 3-year-old, he looked at us with tears in his eyes. As he spoke, his voice trembled, "You can go, you can go." Yet, after less than 3 months, my grandfather was able to take his cow to the fields to plow. The women working in the fields still couldn't believe that my grandfather was able to plow. Later I asked him if during the days of his coma, did he feel everything around him. He thought for a while, then said, "After this time I believe ghosts are real." His endless answer made me fall into deep thought. During those 40 days he dreamed of going into the fields. This field is where my grandparents and grandparents were born and stayed. He said he saw my great-grandfather fishing with my uncle. My grandfather ran back to the fisherman and said, "Dad, let me fish too." Seeing my grandfather, my great-grandfather stopped, then chased my grandfather back without allowing him to fish. After chasing him forever, he finally returned home. That day was the day he woke up after 40 days of coma. Later, I saw that he was much more trustworthy. On Tet, he lit incense and recited prayers. These things would normally be done by my grandmother. Finally, the story of my father. My father's name is Richard. In 2008, my uncle unfortunately had an accident and passed away, so my father bought his truck to run. In the beginning, there weren't many connections and I didn't have to run long distances, so it wasn't a problem. Later, he got a little better and found more matchmakers. Dad had to go to a city in the mountains to find goods. That night my father and Uncle David helped drive together. In the middle of the pass, my father saw a mother and child walking together. He thought, how could he catch a car in the middle of this deserted field, so my father let them go for a ride. Actually, at that time, my father also gave a ride. I don't think much, I just think that if I help someone, someone else will help me. Just like that, Dad left them and their mother in the trunk of the car while I returned to the cockpit. There were no problems even on the long road. It was 7 a.m. when we arrived in the city. Dad then remembered the mother and child, so he went to open the trunk of the car for them. Strangely enough, the entire trunk of the anti-slip vehicle had no one in sight. "Where are the mother and daughter over there?" Uncle David asked my father. "I don't know, they probably got out as soon as the car stopped," Dad answered quickly. "But the outside door is locked, how can I get out?" My father knew that he had encountered that thing, so he didn't say anything anymore and asked Uncle David to put the car in so someone could load the orange into the trunk. When shipping goods through the northern mountainous provinces, you still have to take the goods home. When preparing to go back, the sky was starting to get dark. After being tired all day, the two decided to take turns resting to relieve fatigue. The way back also took 9-10 hours, not less. My dad was so tired that he went to take a nap first. It was past midnight and my father got up to take over for Uncle David to rest. The car drove slowly through the pass, my father drove and played the flute. Dad was driving when a shadow of a child passed from the side of the road. Startled, my father braked suddenly and then steered to the side. The whole car was completely lost on the left half of the road. Under the road there were endless tire tracks. Fortunately, we stopped in time, because the front of the car was now close to the edge of the cliff. Uncle David also woke up when my father pulled the brake and hurriedly pulled him down to check. There was no baby under the footrest wheel. While he was still confused, the phone in his pocket rang, interrupting his father's train of thought. On the screen appeared Mr. Mark's name. "This man is my father's shopkeeper." His excited voice echoed from the receiver, "Have you reached Parsa yet? Is there any problem?" My father asked again, "No, there's no problem. Just now I saw someone calling to report that a vehicle with license plate number 99 was going to the middle of the pass and was kicked to death. It's lucky that it's okay. Why am I still scared?" Dad looked at Uncle David meaningfully. Both of them seemed to gradually understand everything. After this incident, my mother hid her license and did not let my father drive anymore, and my car with license plate number 99 also sold to someone else. And this is the end of the story. Everyone who listens to the story finds it interesting. Please give me 1 like and 1 subscriber. I hope everyone has fun listening to the story. See you in the next videos. Goodbye.